I would like to hand over to Olivier, who will introduce Global Strat and deliver his view of geopolitical events and their implications, after which we shall take questions. Olivier?
Thank you very much, Alex, for hosting this call. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. One thing that Alex didn't mention is that the first part of my career was done in finance, and I was managing a fund for a good 12 years. So I know where you guys are coming from. So it's a pleasure to be in such distinguished company, and I know what you guys are looking in terms of information. So let me start by saying that the new incoming Prime Minister, Liz Truss of Britain, said a few months back when she was a foreign minister that geopolitics is back. I would put to her that it basically never left. It's just that people were not looking at it and didn't think that it was going to be an important issue. Just as an anecdote, my newsletter that I send on a bi-monthly regular timing usually gets about 50 to 60% opening rate from some of my subscribers. Since February, the opening rate has gone up to 90%. So I can tell you that what we're going to discuss today is tremendously important to a lot of people. So let me start by my contention in terms of trend and what I had in my prediction back 4 years ago. My big theme was that 4 countries in the world were eager to rebuild their empires. And those 4 countries are not Britain, France, Greece, and Italy. They are actually Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey. It's not by chance that you will notice that those 4 countries are allies. They see the West, and in particular, obviously, the US as their main enemy and their main obstacle to reach and rebuild their empire. So I'm going to start with, obviously, Russia. I told Alexis I'm going to try to stick to 40 minutes for my presentation, and then we can go to Q&A, but we will have to cover in large Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and then I'll end up with the security and terrorism picture in the world. So let's start with missing the signs, which we always do. People tend not to read or listen to what some of those dictators are saying, but we should. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, Vladimir Putin was a KGB officer based in Dresden, East Germany. While he was scrambling to destroy damning documents, he was also requesting military support from Moscow, but obtained no answer. He said in his bio, "I got the feeling that the country no longer existed, that it disappeared." Putin's goal all along has been to go back to the Great Russia and not let Russia become a second-rate nation. Back last summer, totally put under the radar on the news cycle, Putin sent a big document that we can almost call a book to the US and NATO, asking for demands that both the US and their allies remove all their troops from Eastern Europe and Central Asia. He was expecting an answer, and there was this, if they weren't going to do it, he would act. It's interesting that back in October, we had told our clients that there was an 80% probability of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. We had predicted the timing to be Christmas Day because Putin, being someone very geared on thinking about the symbols, was thinking about the 30th anniversary of the demise of the USSR. The reason it didn't happen is obviously there was the crisis in Kazakhstan that was coming to flourish. And the second thing is that President Xi of China asked his good friend Vladimir to put off the invasion for after the Olympics. And if you remember, the day after the closure ceremony in Beijing, you had the beginning of the operation in Ukraine. Here is where it gets extremely interesting in terms of looking at where we are today in Russia, Ukraine, but also what are the next steps Putin is looking to take. From the get-go, starting in February 24th, our contention was that Putin's objective was not only to take over all of Ukraine, but also to move into Moldova and Georgia. And we still think that those two countries are extremely at risk of a Russian invasion. And here is why. Just 2 days ago, Putin adopted a new foreign policy doctrine called the Russian World, a huge program. Basically, in a nutshell, what this doctrine is all about is to think that it could justify possible near and future invasions of neighbor where 25 million ethnic Russians live since the demise of the USSR in 1991. So de facto, from this, it's a little bit the Hitler scenario, if you will, with the Sudeten and saying, look, there are ethnic Germans living in your country, we need to protect them. Putin is borrowing from this book and looking at all the countries where there are ethnic Russians. And with this doctrine is basically putting this intellectual justification of a possible invasion. This happened just a few days ago, so it's very meaningful for me to see that, and it could spell extreme trouble for especially Moldova and Georgia in the very near future. Indeed, as you may know, Odessa is only 30 kilometers from Moldova. Odessa is the crown jewel for the Russian army to try to take over from Ukraine. But depending on how the military operation goes, Putin might decide to show a victory to the Russian population, and Moldova would be a much easier, or Georgia would be much easier targets than Ukraine has been, even though he thought that he would take Kiev in 3 days. Here are a few points as well that we are seeing in terms of red flags and what could happen. Because of Putin's speech yesterday of mentioning that he was going to basically cancel de facto the deal that was done with the UN and with Ukraine to deliver grains to the rest of the world, and also obviously to deliver gas and oil to Europe. I think that if that were to happen, from my conversation with different governments in the West, him blockading the Black Sea and not allowing Ukrainian ships or international ships that are carrying Ukrainian grain to deliver their goods across the world could be de facto a very, very important source of tension. I'm not saying that we could have a war over this, but what I'm saying is that the West is looking at this extremely closely. It is a matter of obviously national security. Food security is extremely important. Not we tend on speaking only about energy security, but for a lot of countries, food security, especially in Africa and the Middle East, are extremely important because they rely so much on Russia and Ukraine. But that's something for you to keep an eye on. Possible incidents in the Black Sea if Putin were to deliver his threats. Two other things that from February we had told the media. Right after the invasion, I told different TV and print media that I thought the war with Ukraine would last between 10 and 15 years. That was at the end of February, and everybody looked at me like I was a madman. But that's what usually has been happening in recent conflicts. But also, as you've seen, Ukraine has resisted extremely well. That's number one. Number two, there's no reason for this conflict to end within 6 months, and the situation is going to evolve into a war of attrition. As you may have seen already, we are looking at different phenomena that happen when an army starts occupying different towns, and this is where I think the media and some experts are not really looking at this through the prism of the long run, because we had a scenario in place that Ukraine could become an urban warfare if Putin and his army would take over the large cities. We've already seen that in some of the towns that Russia has seized from Ukraine, there are movements of resistance from the population, and there have been Russian soldiers killed by the resistance, but also a lot of people sent by the Kremlins, or what I would call Ukrainians, cooperators that are siding with Russia. A lot of top officials have been killed by Ukrainian hit squads. And I can assure you that in those towns, Russia is going to have a tough time to occupy. And that's one aspect that, I think wasn't in the cards by a lot of analysts, is that even though they missed the boat on saying that Russia was going to strike and occupy Ukraine quickly, that's, as we've seen in the recent past, that's not the most difficult. The most difficult is occupy and win the peace. They had bet that a lot of Ukrainians would side and welcome Russian soldiers with flowers. And obviously it's not the case. But people seem to forget that, tongue-in-cheek, when I said 10 to 15 years, I can get away with this assessment because de facto the war between Russia and Ukraine has been going on for 8 years already, with Crimea in 2014. But what I'm seeing is that right now there is a lot of traction in terms of Ukrainian resistance, the massive help in terms of not only weapons but also intelligence provided, especially by the US and the UK, are making a huge difference. And this leads me to one aspect which we thought would be the modus operandi used by the Russian army, but hasn't been the case. I thought that Russia would follow the Syrian model, especially when they were bringing in the Wagner paramilitary company that is a ruthless group that has no problem of killing, raping, maiming, and stealing and looting everything. At the same time, Putin had, after a few weeks of non-success, appointed the general that was in charge of the operation in Syria to become his main general. Since then, he has fired him. But for us, seeing those signs was extremely concerning, because they could have done, the carpet bombing operations they're doing in Syria, as I said, the war crimes in an extremely brutal fashion and regular fashion. But I'm surprised to see that despite all the terrible acts we've seen from Russia, they could have done much worse. And in a way, Putin is restraining himself. And why is that? Because look, he could go on and try to do a massive bombing campaign with phosphate bombs and carpet and destroy hospitals, schools, and really flatten down towns like Aleppo in Syria. And he hasn't done that. Two reasons for that. First, I think obviously, in a way, in all his madness, he wants to avoid being portrayed as a war criminal and being sent to The Hague for to be put on trial. Also, he doesn't want to have a major conflict with the West that will, in light of his non-success in Ukraine, will be extremely difficult for Russia to run. But here are two other things that I think are important to look at, especially in light of some of the assessment. Today, I'm more optimistic than 3 months ago about the possibility of a chemical or nuclear attack by Russia. About 3 months ago, we were at 10% for the nuclear. We have now retreated back, but the chemical could be an issue. If push comes to shove, Putin is in a bind and needs to get any kind of victory and destroy the morale of the Ukrainians. He could go with a chemical attack, which his friend Assad has done in Syria over 20 times. But at the same time, he's afraid of the reaction of the West. And that's something to keep in mind as well. But there's one thing that I really want to focus on in terms of what Russia has been doing that hasn't been very much publicized. We've all heard about, it's strange that there wasn't, cyber attacks from Russia into Ukraine. It's not true. The day before the invasion, there were more than 200 cyber attacks from Russia into Ukraine. The Ukrainians were very good at stopping most of them, but they paralyzed a lot of data centers in Kiev. But not only that, this is where it gets extremely, extremely testy to look at what Putin has. The Russians have developed an extremely powerful malware to the level of the one developed by the Americans and the Israelis called Stuxnet, that was used to paralyze a nuclear facility in Iran. What the Russians have done is they have developed this malware that even from a lot of tech experts and the Department of Homeland Security in the US say that it will take a few years for the West to stop in their tracks. And what's extremely interesting about this malware is that specifically it was designed to target LNG, so gas facilities, in prevision of what was going to happen. Because right away, when Putin saw that the sanctions were coming in against gas and oil, and that the Europeans were going to turn to some other countries, the US was really the first one they thought of. And so this malware was specifically designated to target LNG facilities, and especially in the US. So I published an article on this about 3 months ago. The months after I published that, there was, if you remember, a massive unexplained explosion in the largest LNG facility in the US, located in Texas. And all of a sudden, that facility that was the main one providing gas to Europe was put offline. At the beginning, they thought it was going to take 3 weeks. Now they're talking about at least 6 months for this facility to go back online. So it's such a huge win for Russia. But what's interesting is that no one really in the US recognized that it could be something else than an accident. And a friend of mine at the Wall Street Journal, after having seen my article and seen that there was the explosion, went to interview the head of the facility to ask for the proof of the reasoning, if it was an accident, and didn't get any answer or any proof. So that's what I would call the behind the scenes war. And so do not discount Russia, because they have many tricks in their hats. And yes, they've been extremely failing on the military front, with a whopping 80,000 soldiers either killed or injured in 6 months. That's a dramatic number. I mean, I've yet to see a conflict that bloody, that quickly. And it's about half of the soldiers that Russia has sent to Ukraine. Two other things that I want to look at in terms of Russia and where it's at are on the diplomatic front, how Russia prepared all this. I started working much more on Russia 3 years ago through Africa, because I was seeing time and again when I was traveling to Africa, in any major country, the Russians were moving in dramatically with this model that they were going to help the dictator in place by providing security. And for that, the dictator would pay in natural resources, mostly, mines, concessions to Wagner, the private military company. But also at the same time, what Russia was doing was preparing to get the support of a lot of countries in the world in case of an invasion, for instance. So as you may have seen, most of Africa, I would say half of Africa, voted or abstained to criticize Russia. In the Middle East, the same thing happened. In the Middle East, it's even more telling that the most classical and strong ally of the US have de facto sided with Russia. Now the picture is a little bit changing, but still, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and at one point Israel were extremely close to Russia. So that's very important to put in perspective that also the two most populous countries in the world, India and China, are on the side of Russia. And for India, it's extremely important to look at this in the context of how India is key for the US. I was told, recently from an American official that India is possibly the most important geopolitical relationship for Washington, and that India would not be sanctioned for its support of Russia because they need India more than any other countries in the world to basically face off with China in the long to medium term. At the same time, what you may have seen is that Putin is trying to leverage his position to create a G8. And interestingly, the members of that G8 that he offered to bring in are obviously Russia, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, Iran, and Turkey. those are not second-rate countries. It's would be interesting to see if India were to join that group, but the other ones, some of those countries are extremely important to the US, and I'm thinking about Mexico. But that's the kind of success that Putin has had in terms of diplomacy. I have two more quick points on Russia, then I'll move to the other three in the interest of time. Obviously, there's plenty of time for us to look at on the Q&A on more questions on Russia. But let me give you two other aspects that are important. So there are two sides of the story of how Russia is suffering from sanctions. Yes, it's very surprising that all those Western multinationals decided to do the right thing and leave. That's probably for me the most surprising aspect on the economic and trade side. But also the Russian economy is suffering in terms of numbers, in terms of industrial production. Just to give you an idea, despite oil and gas revenues pouring at the tune, I saw this morning, was around $150 billion that Putin has gotten in the past 6 months in terms of revenues. Car production in Russia is down 89%. Computer and semis are down 40%. But here is what I think is the most important aspect in terms of the geopolitics of it all, and you'll see how it will help us transition with the question of China. Some of the areas that Russia controls today in eastern part of Ukraine, it's about 22% of Ukrainian territory that are under Russian control. So it's obviously not the majority, but it's a good chunk. But more importantly, the regions where the Russians have control are the regions that are the most rich and wealthy in terms of natural resources. And not a lot of people know that, but Ukraine is not only, rich in wheat, but it's also rich in a lot of different minerals and metals, including having some of the largest world reserves of titanium, lithium, and today it's estimated that the wealth of Ukraine's mineral soil, if you will, is estimated at $12.4 trillion. So let's say that Russia controls this in the long run. They have access to a lot of wealth here. So whether we can say, look, they were not winning military, but they've had access to a lot of Ukraine's wealth. And not only that, about 25% of Ukraine's arable land is also under the occupation of Russia. But here is where the transition with China goes. 10% of all the arable land, agricultural lands in Ukraine are owned by China. So here you'll see that there's in the medium to long term, a lot of friction that can happen between Russia and China. I'll just finish off the Russia part by saying it is for us unlikely that Putin's strategy is going to change his obsession. We don't doubt that only force will stop him. We don't believe there's going to be a coup or a revolution. For us, if the world didn't succeed in getting rid of Assad for all those years, how could they get rid of Putin? That's going to be very difficult. Let me transition here to China, because we have just mentioned China and its alliance with Russia that is against nature, and that's something to remember. If I were any diplomats working in Western capitals, what I would try to do is to divide and conquer and to divide this alliance against the US from both China and Russia, and make the point that in almost any markets or any countries in the world, China and Russia are on opposite sides. And that's extremely important because China's Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road, main area of localization and importance is Central Asia in ex-Soviet republics. So they're basically becoming, including Kazakhstan, where China is the main player. So it has a lot of implications for Russia's sphere of influence, and it's not only in Central Asia, but we talked about Africa earlier. China, as you know, has been for the past 20 years all over Africa, but China is also moving to the Middle East. So those two countries are competing, and things will, if the West plays their card right, they could get Putin and Xi to stop being such good friends. So let me start by saying this is the irony of China's role in the conflict that we just mentioned, is that Ukraine is a very good ally of China, or actually was before the invasion. China is the largest investor in Ukraine. Just before the invasion, they signed a huge investment deal for building infrastructure in Ukraine. Ukraine provided military technology to China that no one else offered China. But still, Xi had no problem siding with Russia against Ukraine. So we talked at the beginning of the call about Putin's strategy and reading what Putin is writing or listening to what he's saying. We should listen, and we should have listened to what President Xi said when he came to power in China in 2013. In his first acceptance speech, Xi made crystal clear that China was on a collision course with the West. Xi said, and I quote, "We have to get prepared for a long and tough period of competition between two political systems." And obviously he wants to win. And the other side running the other political system is, you guessed it, the US. So that's number one. The writing is on the wall. Xi will stop at nothing to have his system win, to rebuild Chinese grandeur and empire. And since 2013, if people have not understood this, now with all the activity on Taiwan and people are finally opening their eyes, there might be a wake-up call. But for us, it's crystal clear that Xi will follow one way or another what Putin has done. He's done it with Hong Kong. He's basically did an Anschluss like Hitler in 1938 taking over Austria. Xi was able to take Hong Kong without de facto any sanctions, with a legal treaty that was not allowing him to move in. So for us, it's simple to see that the Hong Kong win has emboldened him to go after Taiwan. I'll spend just 2 or 3 minutes on Taiwan, and we'll have possibly Q&A on this. But I want you to realize that this is not a question of Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan and this coming out of the hat. It's been a while. I mean, just to give you an idea, just before COVID, I think in 2019, a former US vice president came to see us. He had hired 10 other geopolitical firms to ask them about a scenario of China taking over Taiwan. We were at the time at 25% probability, and that was in 2019. That vice president told me, look, 9 of the other firms are between 1% and 3% probability. Why is that you are 25%? So look, I'm not going to go into the details of what I said, but you can see from reading what the dictators are saying and reading the tea leaves that Taiwan is extremely important, and that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So the question becomes when. Two things could be happening. I'm not convinced, like others, that China will launch a major invasion of Taiwan. I think that it will try to take more subtle ways to take over Taiwan. It could be through a coup, it could be through, a blockade, obviously, but an invasion is going to be extremely difficult. Much more difficult than the Ukraine invasion. Obviously, Taiwan is an island, but not only that. I mean, there's maybe 3 or 4 months of the year because of the winds and the geography that China could invade. But also, the big question remains for the Chinese. They still don't know what the Americans would do, because we can discuss that in the Q&A. But Taiwan has something that Ukraine doesn't have. It has TSMC. Taiwan Semiconductor. And TSMC is national security level for the Americans. There's nothing in Ukraine that is national security. The chips that TSMC produces on mostly US patents are critical to our future. And so there's no way that the Chinese are going to be able to take over Taiwan and de facto TSMC without I think an intervention from the West. Having said that, in the context of time, I'm already at 37 minutes. Let me just switch gears and talk about Iran, which is getting extremely close with Russia. Russia and Iran, have had a love and hate relationship, a lot of love, but not to the level that we've seen for the past 3 months. Obviously, Iran is spending a lot more time, energy, and resources to help Russia. So, as you may have seen in the Washington Post, Iran is already providing Russia with drones. Russians are being trained in Iran to pilot those drones. Russia is launching a satellite on behalf of Iran to basically spy on the whole Middle East and give an advantage to Iran. At the same time, obviously, Iran continues its campaign with a proxy war, the model being terrorism abroad to advance their cause. So it could be kidnappings of Western citizen, killing of the opposition. Obviously, the story with Salman Rushdie over the summer is one example, but also trying to kill John Bolton and Mike Pompeo from the Trump administration. At the same time, what's very important is that Iran is providing Russia with a lot of way to avoid sanctions. And as an example, since February, since the invasion of Ukraine, Iran Revolutionary Guards planes have landed 42 times in Moscow, compared to 3 times for the whole of 2021. Iran is running a proxy war in Iraq, in Syria, especially against U.S. interests and allies of U.S. forces, but also with Lebanon and Yemen. And I would put to you that, we talked about the Russian Empire and the Chinese Empire, but the Iranian Empire is not left far behind. And the Mullah regime's goal has always been to first try to get Islam under their control and get rid of Saudi Arabia's control of the Sunnis, but at the same time trying to to move and seize some or all of the Middle East. I'm sorry, I'm rushing, but I want to go leave some time for questions. So let me go into Turkey. Why is Turkey a problem? Turkey has always been for us the fifth column in NATO under Erdogan. Let's be clear. Turkey was a very good ally before Erdogan. Under Erdogan, a Muslim brother that had no other idea than to restore the caliphate. It has been a very problematic country for the West. So not only we've seen that they're blocking Sweden and Finland to join NATO, they're not sanctioning Moscow. They are trying to get on Biden's good side. Biden has been extremely critical all over his career of Turkey, and at the same time that they're making friends. You may have seen the past 6 months, Turkey is making goods from previous enemies, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Israel, mostly for opportunistic reasons that Erdogan needs the cash from the Gulf to shore up his economy, but at the same time to try to get on Biden's good side by being more friendly. Over the weekend, if anyone thought that Erdogan had changed his stripes, think again. In one of the most aggressive speeches that I've seen him deliver, Erdogan attacked Greece dramatically, threatening of a de facto war against Greece, telling them about the redux of a massacre that happened in 1922. Turkey is trying to redraw the borders set by the Sèvres and Lausanne Treaty of the 20s. Turkey does not recognize Greece's borders, and we are coming towards the time where there's going to be the 100th anniversary of the end of the Ottoman Empire, and Erdogan would want nothing else than to recreate the Ottoman Empire. So, in a nutshell, to finish on these trends, I would say that, like Putin, Khamenei, Erdogan, and Xi will stop at nothing to rebuild their empire. And everybody that is concerned about this needs to understand this, and they are extremely serious. So let me switch. I'll run over a little bit, but let me do security and terrorism in the world, and especially geared towards the ones that are among you that are investing in public companies. Here's what I have in mind. There's going to be a big impact on businesses, especially Western multinationals, from terrorism issues and terrorism legal issues. So there are two cases going on right now. One in France and one in the US against large multinationals. One is the French cement company Lafarge, and the other one is the Swedish telecom company Ericsson. Basically, those two companies are sued because they have financed Islamic State in Syria and Iraq during the period where Islamic State was running the caliphate. Whether they get sentenced or not, there will be huge implications in terms of settlements. And this could open the Pandora's box, because Ericsson's stock fell 20% when it was announced in March that they were involved in a scandal of financing Islamic State. Imagine in your portfolio any Western companies that had still offices in Syria and Iraq during those times. There is no way, knowing what we know about Islamic State and their operations in Syria and Iraq, that they weren't paying off Islamic State for protection. So right there, think about this. There's a possibility of major lawsuits and major settlements that could have an impact on Western multinationals. The second thing, quickly, also a legal aspect. the French large uranium mining company Areva was sentenced by a judge 2 months ago because they didn't do enough assessment on security risk because they had 7 of their employees kidnapped in Niger back in 2013-14. And Areva had to pay 43 million euros of ransom for those. So a lot of companies are going to be also hit with other lawsuits and largely public companies. The last thing I want to say in terms of how it could impact your investment is the possible boycott in 2023 of Western multinationals by Islamist/jihadist. We've seen the example in 2018 where the French food company Danone, publicly traded, was boycotted by a movement initiated by the Muslim Brotherhood in Morocco. They lost 400 million euros of sales in just a few months. What we are looking at today is the replication of that model all over the world, and in particular against Western multinationals. So this is not in the works. This is stuff that we've been working on and that could be of interest to you. Last but not least, here is a prediction, then we'll go to Q&A. The situation in Africa is going out of control with Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. We are looking at the possibility of having mini caliphates in the Sahel. About more than 50% of the attacks of Islamic states around the world are now taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. It's, as you know, plenty of failed states, plenty of coup happening in Africa, and Islamic State is gaining traction, especially since the West is retreating and Wagner is moving in. So we could have potentially mini caliphates in Africa in the near future. Okay, I stuck to 45 minutes. Thank you very much. I'm open to questions now.
Olivier, thank you very much. Covered a lot of ground there, so we are open to questions now. Please either raise a metaphorical hand, and I will admit you into the webinar to ask your question, or use the Q&A function, as people have done. First thing to say is PRK. I think you wrote your question ahead of Olivier answering those points. So if you feel differently, please come back with another question, of course. So we'll move on to the next one. And I'll read it out for the benefit of those listening in. And so Olivier, do you think Taiwan would or should resume a nuclear weapons program, which the US discouraged? And would the response of the US West be different as Ukraine gave up nukes? Being in nuclear power is working for North Korea, for example.
Extremely good question, Arnab. Yes, Ukraine, I would put you're right, would not have been invaded if it had kept their nuclear weapons, and if the West hadn't betrayed them after the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. In terms of Taiwan, to go after a nuclear weapon, I think that with Ukraine, we've seen that to be nimble and quick is extremely important. To be motivated is extremely important. The Taiwanese are looking at much more different hardware than what they've been buying. So they've been buying, huge military jets for a conventional war. What would work is what we call the porcupine strategy, where the Chinese could be bogged down by small and nimble weapons like the missiles that the Ukrainians are using. So as an experience for Taiwan to look at what happened in Ukraine, I think they're much more, and we've seen that with some of their recent purchases, they're much more to buying smaller equipment, but much better to counter Chinese potential invasion.
Olivier, number two, how do you think the West would respond if the PRC moves on Taiwan in a direct invasion or other aggression? Sanctions, possibly where intervention is also more difficult than with Russia and Ukraine.
Yes, it's going to be difficult, but the big clincher here is that I don't think, for many reasons, that the Chinese will be as blatant as to invade Taiwan in a classical military invasion. First, because it would be extremely difficult to sustain and succeed. Second, they have a lot of other ways of taking over Taiwan. One is, as I said, a potential takeover from the inside, so like a coup that would be fomented by pro-Chinese Taiwanese. That could be one of the aspects. Any kind of social media campaign, cyber could also be used. But also there are two things that are important to remember. They could cut off the internet to Taiwan very easily. Taiwan gets 90% of its internet from undersea cables that the Chinese Navy could just get rid of quickly. Second thing, as we've seen with the military exercise that the Chinese has run, they would try to go with a blockade. I think that over 50% of Taiwan's trade is with China. If tomorrow, nothing comes in, not even from the rest of the world, but from China, the Taiwanese economy would be quickly on their knees. To answer your question about what would happen in terms of sanctions, I think that, as I mentioned in my talk, TSMC is the most important thing for the Americans. And there's no way of predicting how the Americans will resist, because they are, without getting into details, there are plans to basically blow up all the factories of TSMC in case of a Chinese invasion. Those are, prepared. So they don't want TSMC to fall into the hands of the Chinese. Could that plan work? Possibly. But there's no telling, and that's why the ambiguity of the US works in this case, is that there's no telling that the US wouldn't intervene one way or another. So that's why I'm saying the Chinese are a much higher way of succeeding and not getting the Americans involved if they do it with a subtle non-military invasion aspect.
Do you expect a more direct decoupling from China by the West?
So yes, there's been, obviously with COVID, a lot of countries realized that we were dependent so much on China for medicine, drug, or anything medical products that we've seen some countries move away from manufacturing in China. At the same time, it's not going to reverse and go on quickly. What we've seen is that there are countries in Europe that are seizing and trying to produce now locally what they call their national security industries. So yes, we will see much more decoupling. And for anyone reading into the geopolitics, do you want to be involved in producing in a country that will likely get into a major conflict in the next few years? I don't think so.
Okay. Stefan, welcome to the webinar.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. We can hear you, yes.
Okay. What would be the sensitivity if sort of the base assessment that Putin is going nowhere is wrong, and sort of the Ukrainian resistance, the Western support, will actually see Putin not succeeding relatively quickly at the scale that he wants? And what would be China's approach? As you said, they are the biggest investor in Ukraine. If they see that Putin is not going to succeed.
Look, your question has many layers, but let's start by saying, in a way, what I said about the war of attrition and how long it will take has been factored in. I mean, you've seen with the body language of Putin that, they stopped going after Kiev, they stopped going after Odessa, they're looking at much smaller targets. I think that what will happen is not a question of how quickly he will take over the Donbass, but what he has in mind, I suggest, is for him to divide and conquer and try to get more of those Ukrainian republics under his belt, because he knows that he cannot get Kiev. I mean, there's no reason why things will improve on the military side of things for Russia, except if he goes all in and he tries to do something like Syria, because they've been extremely successful on Syria, the Russians. So, but I don't think it's in the works. But the main aspect of your question is because of the fact that he will be pushed towards either the door or he will be pushed to produce any kind of victory. I think that the scenario that I said about Moldova and Georgia would, in a way, stop him from going all crazy on Ukraine. So that's one of the things that we're looking at is how much will he try to get other targets to try to divert his public opinion away from Ukraine.
Thank you. Can I have one very quick follow-up question on this? Isn't there a big difference that Ukraine has orders to NATO states, and it's much closer to the Western interest than unfortunately these atrocities in Syria had? And what if the support for Ukraine is as strong, military support, that actually Russia is stuck, and you might call it lose it, or it's just going nowhere?
I think that what you have seen from NATO and from the Americans in particular is to provide Ukraine with defensive weapons rather than offensive. The scenario thought about is this war of attrition in a way. I mean, it's going to last, and they think that within 10 years, Russia would leave Ukraine like it has left Afghanistan, or the US would leave Iraq. And that's the scenario that we have. They are not looking in any kind of air support. I mean, there's no talk about, even in case of a chemical attack, the White House have said, look, we are not getting involved dramatically with US soldiers there, even in a case of a chemical attack, which they didn't do in Syria as well, you're right. But I think it's a given that the scenario goes into a war of attrition, no more involvement of the West in terms of aggressive, offensive weapons. And that's why I said, look, I think it's going to drag on for 10, 15 years until Russia has a new strongman or Russia decides it's enough.
Thank you, Olivier. Mark?
Hi there. A question regarding Putin's strategy around gas from this point, and you kind of mentioned about an expanded conflict into Moldova. How do you see, in a more tactical way, between now and year end, the acceleration of the trajectory, either outside the borders of Ukraine or internally? But from an investment point of view, what would be the ways, macro, commodity, currency, you'd want to express what you see between now and year end? Thank you.
Thanks for the easy question, Mark. I think that there is a rush. I mean, for me, the fact that I mentioned in the call about the new doctrine that hasn't been really publicized of Putin 2 days ago is the red flag that it could happen in the next few months in the invasion of Moldova. And that's why the European Union, especially the French, are trying as quickly as possible to provide not only weapons to Moldova, but also to let them enter the EU. And that's one aspect, because if Moldova enters the EU, then it's a little bit like NATO. If Moldova is attacked while it's part of the EU, then it opens a huge Pandora's box, whereas the other countries of the EU are going to be helping one way or another Moldova. And then on the macro level, imagine how it opens a big Pandora's box. Because we're all talking about NATO. If Russia attacks a NATO country, then all NATO countries are going to come to the defense of that country and get into a third world war. For Moldova, if Putin doesn't act quickly, then on the macro level, it's going to be a huge mess in terms of involvement from the other countries. So there's a race against time. So that's why I'm saying, look, the next 3 months are going to be extremely important, and we may see even more of a conflict, and the markets are going to react in a way that it could impact, and we'll have all those scenarios. So who's next after Moldova? So in a way, gold is going to do fine. The Swiss francs as well, and I think people are going to go into a panic, because that's one way to say, look, Moldova is next. That's another way to see Russian troops in Moldova.
Thank you,
James.
Hello, fascinating. Just out of interest, I'd be quite interested if you could expand a bit further on Turkey, in that I think I'm right in saying there's an election within the next 14 months or something of that order.
Right. Yeah.
Is there a chance that when he does actually get voted out, or is there a chance, because at the moment the economy looks in an exceptionally poor state? Does that mean that he gets desperate and gets involved in a conflict perhaps over those Greek borders? Or I'm really interested if you could expand on Turkey a bit further, please.
Very good. So in a nutshell, yes, the election could be lost. Erdogan has already lost 2 cities from the opposition, and that's a major red flag for him. That's one. The second thing, why is he getting into bed with all his enemies? Is because he needs the cash to basically shore up the economy, and he needs the cash quickly so that the economy is doing better and he can get reelected. You're right. The question of the conflict is up in the air, because obviously we never know with Erdogan, as we never know with Putin, that if he gets pushed on one side, he can unleash violence. And, we know that Turkey has 30,000 plus troops in Cyprus, and that could be the first place he goes rather than Greece all of a sudden. So, yes, a major red flag and a danger zone there.
Thank you.
Olivier, how are you for time?
I have 2 more minutes.
I have many more questions. Okay, let's read one here on. We'll go back to China. Does the extreme China COVID policy make the anti-China narrative less likely to matter, as they self-isolate, impact Western factories in China, and accelerate onshoring?
So, yes and no. I think the narrative is not only on COVID. I think that we've seen with many of the governments we talked to that yes, COVID has the policy has had a huge impact on companies, but we're talking about the geopolitics of it all, and what we've seen as a certain strengthening of China's position in the world, whether in Africa or the Middle East, are making it more likely for China to move in against Taiwan, to move in, against some of its neighbors. So we're part of the thought that the scenario is for Xi third mandate, at least 1 or 2 whether it's military intervention, but at least takeover of territory.
Thank you, Olivier. Given your time constraint, I'd like to thank you for the call today and apologize for those who have outstanding questions. Please email them to me. But on behalf of IRF, and I'm sure all those on the call, again, I'd like to thank you, Olivier, for the illuminating presentation. And I shall be in touch with all those on the call to see if you would like to trial the Global Strat service. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.